Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are right now, welcome back to Sip&Talk.
Hey, everyone. Good to be back.
So, for all you Sip&Talkers out there, we have to talk about what happened in Japan recently. That testimony in the Diet, I mean, it was absolutely intense.
It really was. The atmosphere was grim, is the word.
Right. We've talked so many times about Sanae Takaichi setting that boundary. The idea that if China blocks the Taiwan Strait or, uses force against Taiwan,
Japan could officially enter a state of existential crisis.
Exactly. That specific phrase. It's a legal term, and it should be ringing alarm bells everywhere right now.
It absolutely should, because this is a fundamental shift. It takes the idea of a Taiwan contingency, something people have talked about for years, and moves it from just being a regional risk
to being a Japanese survival situation.
Precisely. That's a total game changer for the entire Indo-Pacific security structure. We really need to unpack what this means. I mean, where is the line exactly for an existential crisis?
Well, and then you get the immediate pushback. You had Yoshihiko Noda questioning her, basically saying the prime minister's statement was unilateral.
He was not happy.
Not at all. He argued it undermines the U.S. strategy of strategic ambiguity, that it could seriously harm Japan's national interest, and, well, that it was already causing a cooling in relations with China.
In terms of economic ties, personnel exchange, all of that?
Yes. And that criticism.
Yeah.
It just screams ostrich talk, doesn't it?
It really does.
That absurd idea that if you just don't poke the bully, everything will be fine. It reminds me so much of Taiwan's KMT always saying, just don't provoke China and we can keep the peace.
But hoping to stay safe by just not annoying the aggressor is so incredibly dangerous today.
It is, because when the other side's intention isn't just a temporary provocation, but actively changing the status quo through things like gray zone tactics or blockades.
Which are non-traditional forms of warfare.
Right. Not provoking them doesn't equal safety. It just means you're not prepared.
In other words, drawing a clear red line isn't the same as actively provoking someone. And honestly, in the real world of geopolitics, ambiguity can often just look like silent consent.
You nailed the metaphor for this before. It's perfect for today's topic. Beware of feeding the monster.
That's right, you remember. We should probably explain what that means.
We can. Or we could just pretend we don't know what it is yet and then start explaining.
What are you talking about? You're confusing me a little bit.
I'm just saying, we can build the suspense.
Okay. Anyway, the point is, it's better to have short-term pain than long-term pain. We'll also need to talk about the strategy for handling this kind of economic or supply chain coercion.
Because if Japan or Taiwan or any U.S. ally can start diversifying their economies and supply chains at the same time, they might build up way more resilience than they could by just relying on military power.
Exactly. And we are going to inventory the bully's playbook.
Oh, yeah. The whole toolkit. We're talking economic sanctions, supply chain control, tourism restrictions,
and those gray zone tactics. Naval blockades, cyber attacks, all of it. These are mixed methods. It's not just traditional war, but a combination of economic, resource, and military intimidation.
And Japan can learn a lot from Australia here, how they managed to diversify after facing massive economic sanctions themselves.
That's a key case study.
So our discussion today is going to be incredibly detailed. Today's theme is beware of feeding the monster. Japan's grim cabinet testimony.
Let's start with what actually happened in that Japanese diet debate.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's November 7th, 2025. Takaichi Sanae is appearing before the House of Representatives Budget Committee.
And you have to understand, this isn't just some casual hearing. This is a high-stakes, high-pressure environment. The focus is entirely on national security planning, on the budget, on what Japan is preparing for.
And Takaichi is the Minister for Economic Security, but she often represents the more hawkish, harder line of the cabinet. And she's confronted directly by former Prime Minister Noda Yoshihiko,
who is a major figure in the opposition. He's there to poke holes in the government's strategy, and he essentially forces the cabinet to put their cards on the table.
His question was a masterpiece of political maneuvering, really.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't vague. It was laser-focused on a specific legal mechanism.
He asked point blank, if a military blockade of Taiwan by China or a direct attack on Taiwan would meet the legal threshold for Japan to declare an existential crisis situation, the Sanzoku Kikijitai.
And for anyone listening, it's so important to get the legal nuance here. The 2015 security legislation that Japan passed set up a couple of different levels for this.
Right. There's a lower level, the important influence situation. That basically allows Japan to provide logistical support like fuel or transport to U.S. forces, but without getting into direct combat. It's about supporting allies when regional peace is threatened.
But the existential crisis situation, the Sanzoku Kiki Jitai, that's the highest level. That's the big one.
It is. It requires 3 very specific conditions to be met. 1, there's an attack on a foreign country that has a close relationship with Japan. 2, Japan's own survival is threatened by that attack. And 3, there are no other appropriate means to protect the Japanese people.
If all 3 of those are met, it is the legal pathway for Japan to use collective self-defense, to actively engage in combat alongside the U.S.
So Noda was basically asking, is a Taiwan contingency a level 1 support situation, or is it a level 2 we might have to fight situation?
And Takeichi's answer was just definitive.
So clear. She said, yes, this situation is very likely to constitute Japan's existential crisis situation.
And that right there, that was the moment of strategic upgrade. Because like we said, leaders before, like Shinzo Abe, used that phrase, a Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency.
Which was a powerful political statement, a slogan.
Exactly. But Takeichi codified it. She turned that political idea into a potential legal trigger for immediate military engagement under the highest possible legal threshold. It wasn't just talk anymore.
And her justification wasn't based on, some abstract ideology or alliance politics. It was about cold, hard facts, about Japanese infrastructure and survival.
Why does Taiwan matter to Japan's existence?
It's all about the Taiwan Strait.
The lifeblood argument. Analysts point this out all the time. 90% of Japan's petroleum imports flow right through that narrow water.
90%. And a massive portion of its regular trade, too. If China imposes a sustained blockade on that strait, or if it becomes an active war zone, that artery is just severed.
It's not an exaggeration at all. It's like someone cutting off the main power and water lines to your entire house. Your country just stops.
Factories shut down, public transit grinds to a halt, the entire energy grid could collapse. It is, by every definition of the word, a survival situation.
But Noda and the opposition, they didn't focus on that. They immediately jumped on the political fallout. They framed Takeichi's clarity as reckless provocation.
Their first argument was that it violates the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity.
Right. This is the core belief of the appeasement camp, isn't it? The idea that if the U.S., the main security guarantor, can afford to be vague to try and keep the peace, why is Japan being louder and clearer than them?
And Noda tried to back this up by pointing to the immediate short pain. He claimed her statement had already caused tangible harm.
A cooling in Japan-China relations, he called it. The travel warnings and, of course, the re-implementation of the Japanese seafood ban.
He even made that pretty dramatic comparison, arguing Takeichi's statement was worse than his own nationalization of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands back in 2012.
I found that fascinating. What was his reasoning there?
Because, he argued, her statement provoked an immediate and massive economic reaction aimed at what China considers its core interest, Taiwan.
So he's basically saying that verbal clarity in Tokyo is now more dangerous than the physical acquisition of disputed islands.
Exactly. Which just shows you how profoundly terrified that cautious political faction is of any short-term economic discomfort. They are willing to trade strategic clarity for temporary economic stability.
So let's look at how the cabinet defended this. Takeichi herself didn't back down.
No, she framed it as an act of democratic transparency, not provocation. She argued she was giving an honest answer to a very specific legal question that was put to her in the legislature. It was her duty to be transparent about national security planning.
And she did leave some legal wiggle room, right?
No, absolutely. She was very careful to stress that the final declaration of an existential crisis would still require a comprehensive judgment based on the, quote, individual specific circumstances of the event.
That legal caveat is so key. She didn't declare war. She just stated that a specific scenario, a blockade, is likely to meet the threshold under existing Japanese law. The decision to actually pull that trigger remains political and depends on the facts at the time.
Yet you could see the internal political friction right away. While the cabinet as a whole backed the policy, other ministers, like the foreign minister, publicly cautioned her to be more prudent in her future statements.
Which is the classic unspoken political message, isn't it?
Totally. It's saying, the policy is correct, but we really wish you hadn't invited this trillion-yen backlash on us. They were basically holding her personally responsible for the short-term pain.
So let's actually quantify that pain. Because the Chinese reaction wasn't just words. It was brutal, and it was fast.
It started literally the next day. You had the diplomatic threats, like that insane chop-off dirty neck comment from one of the consul generals. But that was quickly followed by pulling the big economic levers.
Right. The vice foreign minister, Sun Ridong, summoned the Japanese ambassador, called the statement extremely erroneous and dangerous. That's the official stuff.
But the real punishment, the stuff designed to hurt, was economic and social.
The travel restrictions started rolling out in mid-November. Warnings against travel to Japan, airlines suddenly offering full refunds for flights.
Warnings against studying abroad there. And then the one that really hurts rural Japanese economies. The full re-implementation of the Japanese seafood import ban.
And this wasn't minor, was it?
Not at all. All these measures combined, analysts estimate they led to a 20% drop in personnel exchange between Japan and China. That cripples tourism sectors. The overall economic losses were estimated in the trillions of yen.
Trillions. What does that break down to in US dollars?
Well, just the trade value of Japanese seafood alone before the ban was in the hundreds of billions of yen annually. So you add in the loss from tourism, supply chain disruptions, the total hit easily pushes past 10, maybe 20 billion US dollars. It's a severe, immediate shock to the system.
So that's the reality Noda was pointing to. They paid a massive price for clarity.
They did. But the fundamental question remains. Is that short-term pain worth it to avoid the long-term catastrophe of continued appeasement?
Which brings us right back to the monster. The short answer has to be, yes, the pain is worth it. But we need to really rigorously debunk the logic of that ostrich strategy.
Let's define it again. The logic of appeasement is this idea that you can best maintain your national security by just being quiet, by prioritizing the assumed good intentions of your adversary and avoiding any action or even any rhetoric that might provoke them.
It's security through self-censorship.
It is. And the image of burrowing your head in the sand is perfect. The hope is that if you just make yourself small and quiet and inconspicuous, the bully will just walk on by.
It never works, does it?
Yeah.
It comes down to that core concept. Appeasement feeds the beast. It's like the iron law of aggression.
Aggressors just operate on a different behavioral model. They don't see concessions. And diplomatic vagueness is a type of political concession as a sign of goodwill or a path to understanding.
They see it as weakness.
Exactly. They see it as confirmation that their coercive methods are working. It's a form of reinforcement learning. If China issues a travel ban and Japan immediately softens its stance or apologizes, China learns that travel bans are a very effective tool to modify Japanese foreign policy.
So they'll do it again, and they'll escalate. You're feeding the monster confidence, not satiating its hunger.
And the critics of Takaichi, like Noda, are clinging to the first absurdity of the strategy, which is the belief that her statement caused the Chinese backlash.
Well, let's challenge that for a second. Isn't he right that the Prime Minister's office immediately cautioned her? I mean, doesn't that prove her statement was politically premature and did, in fact, cause immediate avoidable pain?
That's a powerful point, and it's exactly why appeasement feels so tempting in the moment. The pain is real and immediate. But the reality check is this. China's gray zone actions were happening long before she spoke, and they would have continued if she stayed silent.
You mean the naval harassment, the oil exploration in disputed waters, the constant military flights around Taiwan?
All of it. Those things happen regardless of what a Japanese minister says in a committee hearing. Their motive isn't reactive, it's systemic expansion. They want to change the status quo and control the Western Pacific. They will manufacture a provocation or just ignore your silence if it suits their timeline.
So they don't need provocation to act.
They don't. If Japan had remained silent, China would have just moved on to the next coercive step, maybe escalating military exercises near the Senkakus, for example. By blaming Takaichi, the opposition is confusing the symptom, her verbal declaration, with the actual disease, which is systemic aggression.
It's like blaming the person who pulls the fire alarm for the fire.
Perfect analogy. You're blaming the victim for crying out, hoping the perpetrator will stop hitting them. It only makes them bolder. It's a complete abdication of your own agency.
Which leads to the second absurdity, the one with the most frightening historical precedent. The idea that not resisting leads to systemic peace.
And this is where we just have to look at the Munich Agreement in 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flies to Munich. He meets with Hitler.
And he agrees to let Hitler annex the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, all in the name of avoiding war.
He famously came home waving a piece of paper, declaring he had secured peace for our time. But what did that concession actually buy?
It bought Hitler time and resources, and most importantly, the absolute conviction that the Western powers lacked the resolve to actually stop him.
He wasn't satiated. He was emboldened. And the result wasn't peace. The result was World War II, which cost 60 million lives.
Churchill's warning from that time is just perfect. It sums it all up. You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war.
The lesson is crystal clear. If the aggressor's goal is systemic change like absorbing Taiwan or dominating regional commerce making small, incremental concessions only hastens the disaster. It doesn't prevent it.
So if we apply that to today, if Japan were to retreat from Takaichi's clarity, China would immediately test that weakness.
Of course. And a successful blockade or takeover of Taiwan wouldn't stop them. It would validate their claim to the entire region. The next target would be the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, or maybe even greater maritime claims that would further restrict Japanese shipping.
It's a cascading collapse scenario, which brings up the third absurdity. This idea of appeasement isolates you from your own allies.
It absolutely does. Pretending to be neutral or being perpetually cautious is a betrayal of democratic allies like Taiwan, and it fundamentally undermines your relationship with your main partner, the U.S.
The U.S. needs Japan to be a credible, reliable ally in the region. That's the whole point of the alliance.
Right. And if Washington sees Tokyo constantly prioritizing immediate economic comfort over long-term strategic clarity, they start to question the reliability of that alliance. Takaichi's approach, drawing a firm line, it incurs short-term economic costs, yes, but it earns respect. It strengthens alliances like the QAD, and it builds real long-term security.
And it seems the Japanese public understands this.
They do. Polling showed that over 60% of Japanese citizens supported Takaichi's stance. The public has seen decades of China's pressure tactics, and they recognize that being a soft target hasn't brought them any safety. They're just tired of the bullying.
So they recognize the necessity of the short-term pain. The choice is simple, really. Is avoiding a temporary seafood ban worth risking the permanent loss of control over your most vital sea lanes?
Yeah.
History says no.
To really appreciate why that choice is so stark, we need to detail exactly what China does. Let's inventory the bully's playbook.
This is critical because China doesn't just rely on its military. They leverage their huge market size, their manufacturing power, and maybe most importantly, their control over certain raw materials to punish any nation that doesn't comply.
The goal is always political submission. It's not purely about economic gain.
And this isn't just a theory, right? This is a documented campaign.
Oh, yeah. Since 2010, researchers have tracked over 140 distinct incidents of economic coercion by China. They're constantly, systematically testing the resolve of nations all over the globe.
But here's the interesting part, the crack in the armor. The success rate is surprisingly low, something like 30%.
Right, because targeted nations are finally realizing that the only effective counter is immediate, rapid diversification. The cards in this playbook are powerful, but they are finite.
Okay, let's start with the most common tool, the one Japan is feeling right now. Category 1, market retaliation cards. The trade weapon.
These are swift, and they're designed to cause very visible damage. They involve the sudden, aggressive implementation of what are called non-tariff barriers.
So things like overly strict quarantine standards that suddenly appear out of nowhere, or unexplained delays in customs clearance that cause perishable goods, like seafood or fruit, to spoil.
And of course, the big one, punitive anti-dumping or anti-subsidy tariffs that are so high they make the product economically unviable overnight.
Australia felt this immediately. They asked for a COVID inquiry and boom, suddenly Australian wine is facing over 200% tariffs. Barley gets hit with over 80%. These weren't subtle adjustments. They were designed to wipe out entire industries in what was their most valuable export market.
And the example of Lithuania is even more shocking. When they allowed Taiwan to open a representative office in their capital under the name Taiwan, not only did China downgrade diplomatic relations, but Lithuanian goods were literally erased from the Chinese customs system.
What? You mean they just disappeared?
They disappeared. Their trade was just sucked into a bureaucratic black hole. It became impossible to clear any shipments. It just shows you the surgical precision they can use.
That's terrifying. Okay, what's next? The scarier long-term threat. Category 2. Resource and supply chain cards. The monopoly weapon.
This one is about weaponizing China's near monopoly on certain critical materials that the whole world needs.
So they restrict the export of these crucial resources, effectively holding the global manufacturing sector hostage. And Japan knows this pain all too well from the Senkaku dispute back in 2010.
Can you remind us about that 2010 rare earth incident?
Yeah.
Because that was a real wake-up call for the entire world.
It was. In 2010, after a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the Senkakus, China immediately halted all exports of rare earth elements to Japan.
And rare earths are essential for almost all modern technology. Magnets for electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, guided missiles, advanced optics, you name it.
And at that time, China controlled something like 95% of the global supply of these 17 elements. It was a near total monopoly.
Exactly. That single action forced governments around the world, the US, Japan, Europe, to launch these massive, expensive, years-long initiatives to diversify rare earth mining and processing. It was proof that China would use its resource power as a primary political tool.
So today, the risks are focused on other materials like gallium and germanium, which are vital for advanced semiconductors, or graphite, which you need for EV batteries.
Right. If Japan or the US crosses a line, China can just turn off the tap, crippling advanced manufacturing globally.
Next up, Category 3, tourism and personnel cards. This is the service sector weapon, the softer but immediately visible hit Japan is taking right now.
This one is simple crowd control. You impose travel warnings, you limit group tourism, you restrict student exchanges. It leverages China's massive population and its growing consumer market.
South Korea got hit hard with this in 2017 after they deployed the THAAD missile defense system.
They did. China severely restricted group tourism, which instantly gutted the revenue of Korean duty-free shops and the entire retail tourism sector. It's designed to create internal pressure on the government by hurting small businesses and workers directly. Japan is facing this exact play right now.
And finally, the one that proves the ostrich policy is completely useless. Category 4, the gray zone strategy, non-traditional conflict.
Gray zone actions are highly sophisticated. They are designed to change the facts on the ground militarily, informationally, economically, without ever crossing the traditional threshold of a declared war.
So this is the continuous military intimidation, the large-scale exercises around Taiwan, the maritime harassment of fishing boats and commercial ships.
It also includes deep intelligence infiltration and increasingly widespread coordinated cyber attacks aimed at critical infrastructure power grids, banking systems, transportation networks.
And if the aggressor is already operating in the gray zone, actively changing the security environment every single day, then avoiding a verbal provocation is utterly meaningless.
They're already provoking you. They're just doing it in non-conventional ways. The appeasement mindset is dead on arrival when you're facing a systematic gray zone threat.
But let's circle back to the good news. Why are these coercion cards finite? Why do they so often boomerang and hurt China too?
Because China's economic size, while a weapon, also makes it vulnerable. When they ban a necessary high-quality product from a targeted nation, they have to replace it with something. And that replacement is often inferior, more expensive, or both.
The Australian coal example is perfect for this.
It is. When China banned high-quality Australian coking coal, which their steel industry needs, they had to buy lower-quality, more expensive coal from places like Russia and Indonesia. This led directly to power shortages in their own industrial provinces and surging domestic electricity costs. The pain wasn't just absorbed by Australia. China wounded itself.
And crucially, this kind of action accelerates global diversification.
Massively. Nations subjected to sanctions immediately accelerate their efforts at friendshoring and decoupling. This permanently reduces China's leverage over time. Every time they use this weapon, it gets a little bit weaker.
When you combine that self-wounding tendency with China's current economic headwinds slowing growth or real estate crisis, their ability to bear the long-term costs of these self-inflicted trade bans is limited. They risk losing markets permanently.
Which is exactly why Australia's strategy worked.
The Australian case study is the perfect template for Japan and Taiwan. It is just irrefutable proof that enduring that short-term pain is the strategic path to long-term resilience and diplomatic independence.
And the trigger, back in 2020, was so minimal. All Australia did was call for an independent international investigation into the origin of COVID-19.
A completely reasonable diplomatic request.
But China treated it as an existential threat, and the short-term pain they inflicted was immediate and devastating. They targeted all of Australia's key exports with crippling tariffs and bans.
We're talking about their most critical sectors. Coal, which was 30% of their exports, barley hit with 80% tariffs, wine with over 200%, lobster, beef, and the total estimated loss was around 20 billion Australian dollars.
That is a staggering amount of money for a country the size of Australia. I can only imagine the political pressure on the government in Canberra.
For sure. You had Australian lobster fishermen literally watching their valuable catches rot on the airport tarmac because customs clearance suddenly became impossible. Wineries had years of stock piling up with no market to sell to. The whole thing was designed to force a government apology.
But the strategic response was key. Australia held firm. They did not apologize, and they did not back down on their diplomatic stance. Instead, they focused everything on resilience and aggressive diversification.
Let's break down that pivot, starting with coal, which was the most strategic commodity.
Right. China assumed banning Australian coal would cripple their energy sector. Instead, Australia immediately redirected that high-quality coal to its reliable security partners, India, Japan, South Korea. And in many cases, they secured better long-term contracts and sometimes even higher prices.
And on China's side, the boomerang effect hit immediately. They had to rely on that inferior coal, which led to power rationing and blackouts in their own industrial centers, a huge domestic political embarrassment. Australia used its strategic resource power to inflict pain right back onto the aggressor.
But what about agriculture? That's typically much harder to pivot because the Chinese market is just so massive.
This is where trade agreements and proactive government assistance really came into play. Australian farmers and exporters of barley and wine proved to be incredibly agile.
The CPTPP, the big Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, must have been critical there.
It was huge. Because Australia was a member, they could immediately leverage favorable tariff conditions with markets like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Canada to sell their barley. It was also redirected to new emerging markets like Saudi Arabia and Thailand.
And the wine, that took the biggest profit hit, I imagine.
It did initially, but they successfully pivoted to Europe and North America. They focused on smaller, higher-margin buyers instead of the massive, low-margin Chinese market they had relied on.
The payoff was structural stability. They might have had lower profits in the short term, but these new markets came with drastically reduced political risk. They traded maximum profit for maximum security. Their supply chains were now anchored in reliability, not vulnerability.
This shift is what ultimately led to their long-term victory, which became undeniable by 2024 and 2025.
China started to realize their coercion wasn't achieving its political goal, and it was becoming too expensive for them domestically, so they gradually started lifting the bans.
Coal came back first in 2023, then beef, and finally the high-profile one, lobster, in late 2024.
But here's the critical outcome. When China came back to the table, Australia was no longer the dependent partner it had been before.
Exactly. Supply chain diversification was a huge success, reaching an astonishing 70% in some of those targeted sectors. Australia's overall reliance on China dropped significantly. It went from a dangerously high 30% of its total trade down to a much safer 20%. They achieved measurable independence.
And the ultimate proof is in the macroeconomics. Australia's economic growth, projected at a robust 5.2% in 2025, actually outpaced China's slowing growth projection of 4.5%.
They suffered the short pain, they diversified, and they emerged stronger, more resilient, and with far greater diplomatic freedom than before.
The lesson for Japan is just staring them in the face. Their current seafood ban and tourism restrictions, that's their short pain. By holding firm, maintaining Takaichi's clarity, and aggressively diversifying their own markets, they can follow the Australian blueprint to a T.
It's the difference between being a victim of coercion and strategically repositioning yourself to be immune to it. You trade that short-term economic comfort for long-term strategic sovereignty.
And when you have that resilience, you can negotiate from a position of strength, not dependence. Australia found better bans partners, and when the bully came back, they were ready.
So if we connect all these threads, from the Japanese legal necessity to the Australian trade pivot, the Takaichi debate isn't just about security law in one country.
No, it's a global lesson in the rules of coercion. When you're faced with an aggressive power, clarity and resilience are the only two defenses that actually work. Appeasement is, and has always been, a suicidal illusion.
Okay, let's unpack that. We've seen the short-term cost is real. A multi-trillion yen hit. The political discomfort. It's incredibly painful. But if the alternative is permanent vulnerability, strategic surrender, and eventually systemic disaster,
then the path Takaichi chose is clearly the necessary one. She broke the diplomatic silence, and she was backed by the majority of the Japanese public in doing so.
you cannot starve the monster if you continuously feed it confidence and concessions.
The problem is, though, we saw Australia achieve an economic victory. China used the trade weapon, the resource weapon, and the tourism weapon, and they ultimately failed to break Australia's will.
So here's the final thought for you to mull over. What happens when the bully runs out of cards? They've used their full arsenal of economic coercion, and the target nation has held firm and diversified.
Does that mean the aggressor just retreats entirely and accepts the loss of leverage? Or does it push them toward the one card they haven't exhausted yet? Overt military force.
That's the terrifying, provocative question. As we celebrate these short-pain victories, we have to consider what the long-term implications are.
That is definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for the Sip and Talk. If you want to dive deeper into these international issues and think independently about the next steps in global strategy, please subscribe to Sip and Talk wherever you get your listening done.
Also, a big shout out to our old friend Mickey. His YouTube channel, Mickytolife, is back and active, apparently. He just uploaded a video of him and his mom traveling in Seoul, Korea. We're going to check it out right after this. See you next time.